The glass walls of the Ashford Group headquarters offered a commanding view of the city, but Julian Ashford was not looking at the skyline. His focus was entirely on the contract lying on his mahogany desk. A multi-billion-dollar merger was slipping through his fingers, simply because the conservative board of the acquiring firm demanded their partners be settled family men. Julian, known for his relentless ambition and solitary lifestyle, was anything but that. His business partner, Damien Sterling, paced the room, insisting that Julian needed a wife immediately, even if only on paper. It was a cold calculation, just another business transaction. Sienna Hayes entered the office carrying a stack of revised financial projections. As Julian's newly hired personal assistant, she was supposed to be invisible, blending into the sleek, high-pressure environment. But Sienna was different. When Julian barked an order, expecting quiet compliance, she handed him the files with a sharp, uncompromising look, correcting his assumptions about the quarterly losses without hesitation. Julian paused, truly looking at her for the first time. She did not flinch under his scrutinizing gaze. In that moment of silent defiance, an audacious idea took root in his mind. He offered her a deal right there in the boardroom, a temporary marriage, a handsome payout, and absolute professionalism. Sienna laughed, a dry, humorless sound, and told him his money could not buy her dignity. Yet the quiet desperation in her own life, a past she had fled, demanded resources she currently lacked. They negotiated the terms like two rival executives, establishing boundaries of iron. The wedding was an exercise in corporate efficiency. There were no flowers, no tears of joy, only the scratch of a pen on a marriage license in a sterile magistrate's office. Sienna stepped into Julian's world of sprawling penthouses and suffocating luxury, but she refused to let it change her. When he ordered a designer wardrobe for her, she left the boxes unopened in the hallway. Damien watched them closely at every social event, his eyes narrowed with suspicion, sensing that this sudden union was a house of cards waiting to be pushed over, living together forced to shift in their cold arrangement. The penthouse was vast, but they kept finding themselves in the same spaces. Late at night, Julian would find Sienna in the library, illuminated by the soft glow of a desk lamp, reading complex economic theories. They began to bicker over trivial things, which turned into layered debates about power and responsibility. One evening, after a grueling dinner with investors, Sienna kicked off her heels and sighed, her guard dropping for just a fraction of a second. Julian found himself pouring her a glass of water, handing it to her with an unspoken understanding. The air between them grew heavy, with an attraction neither had agreed to in the contract. The fragile peace shattered on a rainy Tuesday. Julian, looking for a missing file, opened a drawer in Sienna's desk and found a hidden portfolio. The documents inside revealed a truth that left him breathless. Sienna was not just a capable assistant. She was Sienna Hayes, the sole missing heiress to the Hayes shipping empire, a fortune she had voluntarily walked away from years ago when she discovered her family's corrupt practices. More devastatingly, it was Julian's own father who had initiated the hostile takeover that ultimately fractured her family. When confronted, Sienna did not back down. She looked him in the eye, her voice trembling but fierce, telling him she wanted nothing to do with the toxic wealth of her past or his present. The revelation felt like a betrayal to Julian, a crack in the foundation of trust he had not realized he was building. A freezing distance settled between them. Julian retreated behind his armor of arrogance, and Sienna became the perfect, silent ghost she was originally hired to be. But the silence was deafening. Julian found himself unable to focus. He realized the emptiness of his life without her sharp wit and grounded presence. He started making quiet apologies. He began brewing her specific complicated coffee order himself each morning, leaving the mug on her desk before she arrived. When she fell ill with a sudden fever, he cancelled a board meeting, a move unprecedented in his career, just to sit by her bed and ensure she drank her tea. Sensing the friction, Damien saw his opportunity. He had been quietly skimming funds from the Ashford Group for months, planning to jump ship to a rival firm. He orchestrated a leak to the press, planning to expose Sienna's true identity at the upcoming charity gala, framing her as a corporate spy sent to destroy Julian from the inside. It would ruin the merger and leave Julian humiliated. The gala was a sea of flashing cameras and whispered rumors. Damien stood at the microphone, a smug smile on his face, preparing to deliver the final blow to Julian's reputation. But before he could speak, Sienna stepped forward, her posture commanding the attention of the entire room. She did not defend herself. Instead, she handed a thick envelope to the lead investor of the merger. It was a complete, meticulously gathered dossier proving Damien's embezzlement and his treasonous communications with their competitors. She had used her brilliant financial mind to track his hidden accounts. The room erupted in gasps. Damien's smugness melted into panic as the investors turned their backs on him in disgust, security moving in to escort him out of the building. He had tried to destroy them, but he was left with absolutely nothing. When the chaos subsided, Julian found Sienna on the balcony, looking out over the city lights. He stepped beside her, the cool night air wrapping around them. There were no contracts anymore, no walls of pride to hide behind. He looked at her, truly seeing the woman who had saved his legacy and captured his heart. He asked for her forgiveness, not with grand promises, but with a quiet, raw honesty. He confessed that his empire meant nothing if she was not standing beside him to share it. Sienna looked up at him, the tension leaving her shoulders, and finally allowed herself to lean into his embrace. The months passed, and the cold penthouse had transformed into a warm home. The initial contract had been shredded and replaced by vows spoken from the heart in a private sunlit garden. Together, they navigated the corporate world not as boss and assistant, but as equals, building a new legacy built on integrity rather than ruthlessness. They had found wealth in each other that no bank account could measure. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear a good story of love and redemption. Subscribe to the channel to follow our next stories. We will see you next time. The heavy oak doors of the attorney's office closed with a definitive thud, sealing Marcus Devereux's fate. The will of his late grandfather was explicit and entirely unreasonable. Marcus had exactly 7 days to marry, or the controlling interest in Devereux Holdings would bypass him entirely and go to his mother, Evelyn, a woman whose ruthless ambition knew no moral bounds. Marcus had spent his life building the company's modern infrastructure, and he refused to let his mother's archaic and cruel methods destroy his legacy. He needed a wife, not a partner, and he certainly did not want one of the polished, manipulative socialites his mother kept parading into his office. He needed someone completely outside their world, someone who would treat this as a simple, transactional job. He placed a highly discreet, bizarrely specific advertisement through a shell corporation, offering a life-changing sum for a 1-year commitment of extreme confidentiality. Vivian Reed was wiping down the sticky counters of a late-night diner when her phone buzzed with the acceptance email. She had answered the strange advertisement in a moment of pure desperation, staring at a stack of past-due medical bills that threatened to drown her. When she walked into the private room of the exclusive restaurant for their first meeting, she was still wearing her faded coat. Marcus sat across the table, expecting her to be intimidated by the crystal glasses and his cold, calculating stare. Instead, Vivian slid into the booth, picked up the menu, and remarked that the prices were a vulgar display of wealth. She looked him right in the eye, her posture unbroken, and asked for the terms of the contract. Marcus was taken aback. He was used to people crumbling under his presence, but this exhausted waitress was trading verbal blows with him, matching his arrogance with a sharp, impenetrable pride. They agreed on the terms over a plate of untouched, expensive food, though Vivian left a lingering comment about how corporate giants like him always thought they could buy human lives. The courthouse ceremony was completely devoid of warmth. They signed the papers in front of a board clerk, and Vivian officially became a Devereux. The real trial began when they arrived at the family estate. Evelyn Devereux was waiting in the grand foyer, her eyes raking over Vivian's simple, unbranded dress with undisguised disgust. Evelyn immediately began probing, demanding to know Vivian's lineage and social standing. Vivian did not flinch, offering polite but incredibly vague answers that left Evelyn seething with suspicion. Marcus watched the exchange, surprisingly impressed by his new wife's iron resolve, but he warned her later that night that his mother would not stop until she found a weakness. Vivian simply told him that she had survived much worse things than a wealthy woman's bad manners, and firmly refused the platinum credit card he offered her for a new wardrobe, insisting she would wear her own clothes. Living in the sprawling mansion forced an uncomfortable proximity upon them. They were like two wary animals circling each other in a gilded cage. Marcus was obsessed with his work, often bringing his stress home, barking orders at the staff. One evening, Vivian calmly interrupted his tirade, exposing the absolute emptiness of his behavior, telling him that barking at the housekeeper did not make him a king, it just made him a bully. It was a heated argument, filled with pride and buried tension, but it ended with Marcus actually apologizing, a rare occurrence in his life. Slowly, the ice began to thaw. When Marcus accidentally sliced his hand deeply on a broken whiskey glass during a frustrating phone call, Vivian did not call the staff. She sat him down in the vast kitchen, brought out a first aid kit, and carefully, tenderly bandaged his hand. The silence between them shifted from hostile to heavy, with unspoken attraction, his thumb gently brushing her wrist as she worked. The fragile peace shattered during a mandatory dinner with the board of directors. Evelyn had been digging, and she finally found the dirt she was looking for. She casually mentioned a small manufacturing plant in Ohio that Devereaux Holdings had acquired and liquidated a decade ago. Vivian froze, the color draining from her face. Later that night, in the privacy of their wing, Marcus demanded to know what was wrong. The confrontation was explosive. Vivian finally confessed her secret, the pain raw in her voice. That small plant had belonged to her father. The aggressive, underhanded tactics used by Devereaux Holdings had bankrupted him, destroyed her family, and forced her into years of poverty and struggle. She admitted she had taken his money not just to survive, but to funnel it back to her sick father, taking back a fraction of what was stolen from them. She threw the reality of his family's wealth in his face, leaving Marcus standing in stunned silence. The truth cut deeper than any lie could have. A profound distance grew between them. Vivian built a wall of pure ice, performing her duties as a wife in public, but refusing to look at him in private. Marcus was consumed by guilt. He did not buy her diamonds to apologize. Instead, he quietly began an investigation into that old acquisition, discovering the illegal and horrific pressure tactics his mother had authorized to crush Vivian's father. Without saying a word to Vivian, Marcus arranged for top-tier specialists to take over her father's medical care, covering every expense anonymously. He made sure her favorite cheap diner coffee was waiting in the kitchen every morning, taking the time to brew it himself. These silent gestures of care began to chip away at Vivian's anger, showing her a man trying to atone for sins he did not commit. Evelyn, however, was ready to strike her final blow. Armed with the full truth of Vivian's identity and her motive for the marriage, she confronted the couple in Marcus's office. She threatened to expose Vivian to the press as a fraudulent extortionist and have her arrested for corporate espionage unless she signed annulment papers immediately and walked away with nothing. Evelyn smiled her cruelest smile, believing she had finally won and secured her power over the company. She had profoundly miscalculated. Marcus did not hesitate. He stood between his mother and his wife, his voice dangerously low. He revealed that he already knew everything, and then he dropped a massive file on his desk. It was the complete documentation of Evelyn's illegal activities during the acquisition of Vivian's family business, and evidence of several other corporate crimes she had committed. The power dynamic reversed in an instant. Marcus looked his mother in the eye and calmly informed her that she was being stripped of all her voting rights and permanently exiled from the board of Devereaux Holdings. If she ever threatened Vivian again, the file would go directly to the federal authorities. Evelyn, completely stripped of her power and abandoned by the sycophants she had paid for years, was escorted out of the building, her reign of terror over. In the quiet aftermath, Marcus turned to Vivian. The corporate armor was entirely gone. He offered a sincere, sweeping apology for everything his family had done to hers, and he confessed that he loved her, deeply and completely, without any conditions or contracts. He told her she was free to walk away with her settlement, but he begged her to stay. Vivian, seeing the absolute sincerity in his eyes and knowing the lengths he had gone to protect her and her father, finally let her guard down. She closed the distance between them, wiping away a stray tear, and told him that she wasn't going anywhere. A year later, The cold Devereux mansion felt completely different. It was filled with light and the chaotic energy of a home that was actually lived in. Vivian had used her sharp mind and Marcus's unyielding support to launch a foundation that provided grants and business education to small, family-owned enterprises, ensuring no one else would suffer the fate her family did. They had rebuilt her father's legacy together, and in doing so they had built a true partnership, leaving the toxic shadows of the Devereux history far behind them. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear a good story of love and resilience. Subscribe to the channel to follow our next stories. We will see you next time. The invitation sat on Sebastian Kane's glass desk like a venomous snake. Theodore Lang, his most ruthless business rival, was getting married. The wedding was a highly publicized merger designed to push Kane Enterprises out of the international market. Sebastian was not going to attend just to swallow his pride. He needed a weapon, a statement that would shatter Theodore's perfect media narrative. He knew exactly who to find. Margot Ellis had been Theodore's fiancée, quietly discarded and erased from the social registry when she was no longer useful to the Lang empire. Sebastian intended to bring her as his date, a walking reminder of his rival's cruelty. He tracked Margot down to a quiet, dusty antique bookstore on the edge of the city. He expected a broken woman, but when he presented his lucrative offer to play his adoring partner for the season, she merely dusted off a leather-bound novel and looked at him with cool indifference. She did not care about his money or his corporate warfare. She called his scheme childish and hollow, but when Sebastian mentioned the opportunity to stand in front of the high society that had exiled her and show them she was unbroken, a spark of defiance lit up her eyes. They struck a deal not for cash, but for a chance to reclaim her dignity. Their first public appearance was a masterclass in tension. The contract was signed, the boundaries drawn. Sebastian had ordered a diamond collar for her to wear to the wedding reception, but Margot left it in its velvet box, clasping a simple faded silver locket around her neck instead. She told him her worth was not measured by the weight of his stones. When they walked into the grand ballroom, the silence was immediate. Theodore Lang dropped his champagne glass, his face pale as he stared at the woman he had thrown away, now standing tall and radiant beside his greatest enemy. The media frenzy demanded they keep up the charade. Sebastian and Margot found themselves thrust into a whirlwind of galas and press dinners. Their private moments, however, were battlegrounds of wit. He tried to manage her every move. She challenged his need for control, exposing the lonely reality of his heavily guarded life. Yet, underneath the sharp words, a reluctant respect grew. One evening, escaping a suffocating charity auction, they found themselves caught in a sudden downpour on the terrace. Without a word, Sebastian took off his tailored jacket and draped it over her shivering shoulders, his hands lingering just a second too long. It was a silent, tender gesture that betrayed the cold terms of their agreement. The facade shattered 2 weeks later. During a high-stakes negotiation dinner, Margot suddenly collapsed, her breathing shallow and erratic. Panic gripping his chest, Sebastian rushed her to the hospital. It was there, pacing the sterile corridors, that the crushing truth was revealed to him. The emergency room doctor, recognizing him as her partner, explained the severity of her condition. Margot was battling a rare progressive illness she had hidden from everyone. The devastating part was the context. Theodore Lang had not just left her, he had abandoned her the moment she was diagnosed, viewing her health as a liability, and had subsequently stolen the medical patents her family had developed, leaving her destitute and fighting for her life alone. Sebastian was entirely consumed by guilt. He had dragged a woman fighting a silent war into his petty corporate dispute, using her as a pawn. Unable to face his own cruelty, he withdrew. He became distant and cold, speaking only when necessary. But his actions spoke differently. He secretly bought out the debt of her medical bills. He quietly cancelled international flights just to make sure he was in the city on the days of her treatments. He began leaving rare blooming orchids on her reading chair, knowing they were her favorite, never once taking credit for the fragile gestures. Theodore, desperate to regain his footing, discovered the truth about their fake relationship through a bribed hospital administrator. He cornered Sebastian in the Kane Enterprises lobby, threatening to leak Margot's private medical records to the press, framing her as a tragic, dying fraud who had scammed her way into Sebastian's bed. He demanded Sebastian surrender the European shipping contracts, or Margot would be humiliated on a global scale. They were forced to attend one final glittering charity gala to maintain the illusion and intercept Theodore's plot. Theodore took the stage, preparing to deliver a speech that would thinly veil his blackmail and destroy them both. But Sebastian had spent the last week weaponizing his anger. As Theodore spoke, the massive screens behind him meant to show the charity's logo suddenly flickered. Financial documents, stolen patent registries, and offshore bank transfers flashed for the entire room to see. Sebastian had used his vast resources to completely dismantle Theodore's empire, proving the fraud and theft of Margot's family patents. As the crowd gasped, federal investigators, tipped off by Sebastian hours earlier, walked into the ballroom and escorted a stammering, ruined Theodore Lang out in handcuffs. In the deafening silence that followed, Sebastian turned to Margot, oblivious to the stares of the elite. He did not boast about his victory. Instead, he took her hands, his voice thick with raw emotion, and apologized for ever treating her like a chess piece. He confessed that the fake relationship had become the most real thing in his life, and that he loved her, sickness and all. Margot, tears finally breaking through her stoic exterior, saw the absolute vulnerability in the powerful man standing before her. She forgave him, stepping into his arms as the room burst into frantic whispers. 2 years later, the cutthroat corporate world of the city was a distant memory. Sebastian had stepped down as CEO of Kane Enterprises, leaving it in capable hands. He and Margot had moved to a quiet, sun-drenched coastal town. They used the recovered patent money to fund a medical research clinic, living a peaceful life dictated by the rhythm of the ocean and the strength of their love. They had left the empire of glass and steel behind, finding a much richer kingdom in each other. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear a good story of love and justice. Subscribe to the channel to follow our next stories. We will see you next time.
Editor. The infographic explains how the 3 stories use romance, wealth, conflict, and redemption to explore much deeper psychological and social issues. Although the characters and circumstances are different, each story begins with a relationship created for practical reasons rather than love. Julian needs Sienna to protect a merger, Marcus needs Vivian to secure his inheritance, and Sebastian chooses Margot as part of a public strategy against a rival. In every case, the woman is initially treated as a solution to a powerful man's problem. However, the emotional center of each story emerges when that arrangement stops being a transaction and begins to expose the fears, wounds, and moral weaknesses of everyone involved. The psychological analysis shows that the male protagonists use control as a form of emotional protection. Their wealth and authority allow them to dominate professional environments, but those same qualities also hide loneliness, guilt, and fear of vulnerability. They are accustomed to managing people, outcomes, and appearances, yet they do not know how to build honest intimacy. The women challenge this behavior because they refuse to be purchased emotionally. Sienna protects her dignity even when she needs money. Vivian rejects the idea that luxury can erase injustice. Margot refuses to let illness, abandonment, or social humiliation define her value. Their self-respect forces the men to confront the difference between possessing power and deserving trust. Trauma also shapes every relationship. Sienna carries the consequences of family corruption and the destruction of her past. Vivian lives with the damage caused by a wealthy corporation that ruined her father. Margot suffers from illness, betrayal, and the theft of her family's work. These experiences explain why trust develops slowly. The women cannot simply accept apologies because the harm they experienced was connected to the same systems of wealth and privilege represented by the men. Trust is rebuilt only when words are followed by consistent action. Julian cares for Sienna when she is ill and begins to change his daily behavior. Marcus investigates his family's crimes and protects Vivian's father. Sebastian abandons his pride, exposes Theodore's corruption, and uses his resources to restore what was stolen. The social analysis reveals a strong contrast between extreme wealth and ordinary struggle. The stories show how money can create opportunity, but also how it can become a weapon. Corporate mergers, inheritance rules, public reputation, hostile takeovers, stolen patents, and financial crimes all demonstrate how powerful institutions can damage private lives. The women represent people who suffer the consequences of decisions made in boardrooms. Their presence forces the stories to question whether success has any value when it is built on exploitation. Gender and power are also central themes. The women are not passive prizes waiting to be rescued. They are intelligent, morally decisive, and essential to the resolution of the conflict. Sienna uncovers embezzlement, Vivian exposes the human cost of corporate cruelty, and Margot becomes the reason Sebastian recognizes the emptiness of revenge. Their strength does not come from wealth, but from integrity, emotional endurance, and the courage to speak uncomfortable truths. The infographics' core message is that redemption requires accountability. Love becomes real only when the powerful characters stop using people and begin protecting them without demanding control in return. The corrupt antagonists lose their influence because they depend on manipulation, secrecy, and fear. The couples succeed because they replace those values with honesty, reciprocity, and respect. In this way, the stories suggest that the greatest form of wealth is not status, property, or inheritance, but a relationship in which both people are seen, valued, and treated as equals.